Steve Jobs was many things. A genius, a prolific inventor, an innovator, a visionary. But he was also an asshole.
Not turn it on. Here.
A dictator. Mean. Vicious.
What, you gonna fire me?
No! I already fired you! Why are you still here?
A human being who demanded perfection from his employees and total control of his products. And if he didn't get it, he had no problem flipping off the handle and firing anyone who stood in his way. And this year was a big year.
2010, we're going to take the biggest leap since the original iPhone.
The iPhone 4, a total redesign, a revolution in tech. This year especially, Steve had to make sure the announcement of his product, his baby, was exactly the way he wanted it, and anyone who got in his way would be sure to pay dearly. Enter Gizmodo. A lowly internet tech rag full of sweaty bloggers who had never announced a product in their lives, never marketed so much as a sandwich. Jobs like David Pogue at the New York Times, Walt Mossberg at the Wall Street Journal, they were classy journalists, not the technology branch of gossipy Gawker media whose biggest claim to fame is publicizing a Hulk Hogan sex tape. Steve Jobs was a master marketer. But this year, Gizmodo, a tech blog, would do the announcing for him.
This is a day I've been looking forward to for 2.5 years.
Each year, Steve Jobs would walk up on stage and proudly announce the new iPhone. And each year, it was a total surprise, totally coordinated and controlled by the dictator-like behavior of Steve Jobs. When Steve Jobs lost control, you did not want to be close by. When I worked at the Apple Store 5th Avenue, the managers told us the story of when Steve saw an employee in an Apple shirt smoking outside the store and fired him on the spot. He allegedly fired a group of Pixar employees early in the company, and when an employee pleaded with him to at least give 2 weeks' notice, he said, "Okay, but the notice is retroactive from 2 weeks ago." Damn. And Jobs took secrecy to another level. At Apple headquarters, one infinite loop at the time, any unreleased product was bolted to the desk, under constant surveillance, behind doors with multiple locks with codes changing every few minutes. Not only that, they have their own security force constantly patrolling for spies and making sure employees aren't blabbing about that new feature that Steve was so eager to announce. There were even rumors that an intense Apple leak investigation led one Foxconn employee in China to delete themselves. The leak of an unreleased product was Apple's worst nightmare and completely unacceptable to Jobs. And a leak of an unreleased iPhone meant that Apple could lose millions of dollars, other companies could steal his ideas, steal his design, and worse, he could lose control over the narrative. But the thing about a cellular device, you couldn't just test it under lock and key. At some point, you had to let it out into the wild.
To make a wireless product work well, you have to test it. And there's no way to test it in a lab completely, so you actually have to carry them and test them out.
So imagine the horror. Imagine the absolute rage. For a man who goes to such great lengths to protect his prototypes, lengths that allegedly led to the self-death of a factory worker, and a man who controls the narrative at all costs, to wake up 3 months before your product's announcement to this. The screams coming out of Steve Jobs' office, I can only imagine, could be heard throughout the entire building. For the first time ever, an Apple product was accidentally leaked months before its announcement. But not only leaked, the actual product was in the hands of a tech blog that new Apple fanboys would kill to learn about a new iPhone before launch. A tech blog that would pay handsomely for a scoop like this. Especially a tech blog that had been slighted by Steve Jobs months earlier. But the emotions bubbling up in Steve must have been nothing compared to the anxiety felt by a 27-year-old Apple software engineer named Gray Powell, the boy who accidentally lost the prototype of the iPhone 4 on his birthday. Gray was testing the new iPhone 4 out in the wild. He was working on the iPhone baseband software, the code that enables the iPhone to make calls. He was given an iPhone 4 prototype that was disguised as an iPhone 3GS. And on his birthday, he decided to go out to the Gourmet House Stout, 20 miles from Apple headquarters with some friends. He was celebrating, possibly drunk, as is the tradition on birthdays, and when he left, he didn't realize that the prototype iPhone 4 disguised as a 3GS, a device kept under intense security with a whole Gestapo police force dedicated to preventing leaks, bolted to desks, codes changed every few minutes, was sitting there on his bar stool at a Cupertino bar. I can't even begin to imagine the panic. This programmer, this kid, Gray Powell, who was probably afraid to talk to the man Steve Jobs on a good day, was going to have to walk into the office and tell one of the meanest, angriest geniuses working in tech that his baby, his brand new design, his hundreds of new features were about to be announced by a fucking blog. And when I tell you it was hotly anticipated, I mean it. Think about now how anticipated new iPhones are and multiply it by 100. Every year Apple put out a phone at the time, it was either a numbered model or an S model. The numbered model was a complete redesign with blockbuster features, and the S model would come out the following year. And since 2009's iPhone was the 3GS, we could deduce that the new iPhone would be completely redesigned and revamped. And it was. This was the first iPhone with a front-facing camera. The first iPhone with a flash. The first iPhone with a Retina display. And Steve Jobs couldn't announce any of it. Enter Brian Hogan. Brian Hogan was having a night just like any other night. A 20-year-old having a drink at the local beer garden. So, as the iPhone 4, disguised as an iPhone 3GS, sat there on the stool, Brian sat next to it. According to Brian, after the last call, both of my friends went to the bathroom. As they left, a random drunk guy came out, walked up to me, picked up the phone on the bar stool next to me, and said, "Don't forget your phone." I told him it wasn't mine and I didn't know who it belonged to. Random drunk guy hands me the phone and tasks me with finding its owner. I ask around and can't figure out who it belongs to, and after my friends returned, we left and walked home having intentions of figuring out who the phone belonged to and giving it back. An update to the phone's Facebook app showed Brian that it belonged to Powell, but by the next morning, the phone was remotely disabled. He noticed the screen was a higher resolution than he was used to, and the buttons were in weird places. He took the case off and discovered this was no iPhone 3GS. The first thing he did was reach out to Apple to try to return the phone, but Apple's strict security backfired, as no employee was aware of the leak, so no employee took him seriously. After he tried to return it, he did something most of us would probably do and initiated a bidding war between tech blogs Gizmodo and Engadget. This story was big. Apple leaks were so few and far between, one leak would mean millions of hits, tens of millions. So Brian asked for $10,000 from both Engadget and Gizmodo. Gizmodo offered him $5,000 with the promise of $3,000 more if the device turned out to be real. Hogan took the money from Gizmodo, and the article is still Gizmodo's most clicked on post of all time. Jobs was furious.
Fuck you, Gizmodo!
He was not going to let them get away with this. The retribution started with Gizmodo and ended with Brian Hogan. To understand the gravity of this punishment, you have to know one thing. A seat in the theater as an Apple event was going on was a coveted position and meant almost guaranteed hits for your blog. Back in 2010, there was no live broadcast of these events, so regular guys like me had to rely on blogs like Gizmodo to be at these events and live posts about what was being said. MacRumors, Engadget, and Gizmodo were my three go-betweens on Apple event days, so Jobs' first action against Gizmodo was to ban them from these Apple events.
You're banned.
Jason Chen, the Gizmodo writer who bought the phone from Brian and posted the story, had it worse. The San Mateo County District Attorney's Office said Apple had contacted his office to report the crime, and soon after, police raided Jason's home while he was out at dinner. The police broke down his front door and seized 4 computers, 2 servers, an Apple iPad, as well as other devices. When he returned home through his broken down door, they served him the warrant. Jobs was gaming for an extortion charge against Gizmodo, but he couldn't get it. After seizing Jason Chen's computer, the San Mateo County District Attorney Stephen Wagstaff said, "What we were looking at was possession of stolen property and whether the evidence supported extortion. You can say we were looking at whether their actions supported that they participated in the theft of the phone. We didn't think it supported either." But that's not all the seized computers revealed. Months earlier, Gizmodo had been promised a first look at the new iPad, but at the last minute, their permission was revoked and they had to scramble to come up with a new story. The DA commented that the laptop supported this. It was obvious that they were angry with the company about not being invited to some press conference or some big Apple event. We expected to see a certain amount of professionalism. This is like 15-year-old children talking. There was so much animosity and they were very critical of Apple. They talked about having Apple right where they wanted them and they were really going to show them. But despite the evidence, Jobs insisted it was extortion. There was an email exchange between Jobs and the Gizmodo editor Brian Lamb with conditions that had to be met before Gizmodo would hand the prototype back to Apple. It conflicts with my own responsibilities to give the phone back without any confirmation that it's real from Apple officially. Right now we have nothing to lose. Apple PR has been cold to us lately. I want to work closer with Apple too. I'm not asking for more access. We can do our jobs with or without it, but again, this is the only way we can survive while being cut out of things. So what Brian Lamb said was close to extortion, but he never quite got there. No one got it worse, though, than Brian Hogan, the guy who sold it to Gizmodo. According to an AMA Brian posted to Reddit back in 2013, his life got completely overturned by the saga. The actual crime was the least of his problems, as he was only charged with misdemeanor misappropriation of stolen property, which came with a fine of $125, 40 hours of community service, and 1 year of informal probation, after which his record was expunged. Apple valued the device at $250, and Brian and his friend both paid half. Gizmodo totally screwed him over, denying him the $3,000 they promised when confirming that the phone was real. And according to Brian, the $5,000 he received from Gizmodo was nothing close to the amount he had to pay the lawyer he had to hire. Apple didn't go easy on him either. Apple held a lot of sway in the area, including a board seat on a tech crime task force that just so happened to take this case. They raided his apartment, confiscated his things, and never returned his Canon camera. But maybe worst of all was the media attention. His girlfriend made a Facebook post about him finding the phone. When he found out, he made her delete it, but before she did, the word got out and his name got leaked to the public. This led to Brian and his family having to leave their house for 3 weeks because news vans found out where he lived. And 3 months later, Brian and his girlfriend broke up due to the stress. Later, Brian found out that his roommate was talking to the cops the whole time, telling them everything she could because she thought she might get a reward. According to Brian, she took pictures of his things, wrote down conversations, and lied. She took a picture of the box that he was holding the money in, and it was allegedly her computer that he plugged the phone into when he tried to activate it on iTunes. But after he plugged it in, the phone bricked, probably because of remote deactivation. The only person to get off light in this case was Powell, surprisingly, the engineer who lost the phone. He was fired, but days later, rehired. So, besides the initial anxiety of having to come clean to Steve about his party foul, he came out okay. Later, at the D8 conference run by his friend tech reviewer Walt Mossberg, he had this to say.
When this whole thing with Gizmodo happened, I got a lot of advice from people that said, you've got to just let it slide. You shouldn't go after a journalist because they bought stolen property and they tried to extort you. And I thought deeply about this, and I ended up concluding that the worst thing that could possibly happen as we get big and we get a little more influence in the world is if we change our core values and start letting it slide. I can't do that. I'd rather quit.
Steve Jobs pursued every legal avenue he could to get back at those who stole his prototype, but in the end, he could only hurt them so much. The iPhone 4 was not done with controversy once it was released, and it could have been prevented if Powell's phone didn't have an iPhone 3GS disguise, a controversy that led to Apple giving away free cases to anyone who asked. It was called Antennagate. Subscribe to hear that story. If you made it this far, I assume you like this content, so now's the time to pitch my Patreon and my Twitter. I would love to connect with you guys on Twitter and talk about this stuff more, and I would also love to not have to move back in with my parents. So, if you like this content, I would really appreciate a donation. Thanks for watching.